The biotech and pharmaceutical industry is one of the most important in the world, both when it comes to the economic situation and the side of that, and also of the services these industries provide. We all depend on medicine and other products developed and manufactured by biotech and pharmaceutical companies. But biotech and pharma are also big emitters. They are responsible for releasing 193 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere in the latest measurements from 2022, so 2022. And this is according to My Green Lab, an organization we'll be talking to shortly here in this session. And what's more, the emissions are in scope 3, meaning that they originate upstream in the supply chain. So decarbonizing biotech and pharma would be having really far-reaching impacts. Well, there is some encouraging news about the biotech and pharma industry. Many of the largest companies have made commitments to decarbonize, and some have already started to make the necessary changes. Here to tell us more about this, we have James Connelly. He's CEO of My Green Lab. He's here waiting for us, and he will give us a keynote and a presentation here to start us off. So I hand it over to you, James. Could you unmute, please, James, because I think you're muted?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
It's fantastic to be live from Baku to present the latest revision and update to our Carbon Impact of Biotech and Pharma report. So many people are not familiar, but laboratories in the life science industry is a significant contributor to global climate change. Laboratories are some of the most resource-intensive buildings of any kind, 10 times more energy than traditional commercial office spaces, 4 times more water, and life science and laboratories produce a massive amount of plastic and other hazardous waste. There's a 2015 study that showed that academic research alone produced 2% of global plastic waste. So we think if we scale that up to commercial, clinical, and healthcare labs, it could be as great as 10% of global plastic waste. And an update from the 22 data that was just shared in our new Carbon Impact of Biotech and Pharma report, using a broader data set of companies in both public and private companies, we found that biotech and pharma produces nearly 400 million metric tons of CO2 annually. That's equivalent to greater than 1,000 natural gas-fired power plants. Clearly, biotech and pharma has to be part of the climate solution. And our report that we originally released in 2021 was the first report to look across all 3 scopes of impact for the biotech and pharma industry. Scope 1 is the direct, if people are not familiar, Scope 1 is the direct emissions from fuel burned on site or by company vehicles. And Scope 2 is indirect, the carbon emissions from electricity that a company or an organization purchases. You can kind of think of Scope 1 and 2 as the carbon footprint from things that are under the control of an organization. But actually, the majority of carbon impacts, as mentioned previously, come upstream from purchased goods and services, all the transportation of those goods, business travel, fuel for processing, as well as downstream. Once products are made and they go out into the world, the use of those products as well as where they go at the end of their life. So you have to look across all 3 scopes to understand the totality of the impact of an industry and understand opportunities for change. So before I dive into the findings of the report, I want to just share with everyone a few key concepts. So we're here today in large part because of the Paris Agreement, which was a legally binding international treaty adopted in December 2015, with a goal to limit global temperature increase well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees C. So we're going to talk about 2 degrees and 1.5 really being the number that the IPCC warns we cannot cross to avoid the worst and cascading impacts of global climate change. So I'm going to be talking about carbon intensity So if you look at a company and if you look at a company's trends, it's useful to actually evaluate the efficiency of that industry of that company over time, which can be measured by carbon intensity per unit of revenue, the amount of carbon they're emitting to produce a certain amount of revenue. I'm going to talk about the Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, which is a way to develop climate scenarios, or a network that's developed a number of climate scenarios that allows you to look at portfolios and model them for different scenarios through 2030 and 2050. And last, although Larry's going to cover this much more than me from ICE, I'm going to talk about implied temperature rise, which is a metric that estimates the contribution of countries or companies or a group of companies, a portfolio, to global temperature rise. To really simplify it, below 1.5 is good, above 2.0 is bad for implied temperature rise. So if we look over the past 6 years of data for the global biotech and pharmaceutical industry, we actually see some really encouraging signs. The top 15 and top 25 companies, represented by this blue line at the bottom of my screen, are actually showing annual emissions reductions, about 2% on annual average reductions since 2018 for scope 1 and 2. They're directly controlled emissions. If you look for scope 3 for those same companies, the top 15 and top 25, which is the dotted line above, the picture is not quite as clear. We see some variability with increases in 2019 as well as 2022, but over the last year we have seen reductions in scope 3, and we think those peaks are often due to better reporting as the industry more accurately reports their impact. However, if you look at a broader data set, 140 companies for which we have data available from high quality data from 2018, while we did see year-on-year reductions of scope 1 and 2 through 2022, they've actually started to increase in 2023. And while scope 3 has remained pretty much level, there has also been a slight increase. The good news, though, being the largest companies, the ones with most aggressive climate targets, are starting to actually decouple revenue growth, financial success from growing carbon emissions. And we see that as a growing trend across the industry. Another piece of really positive news that we found looking at the data is that the number of companies for scope 1 and 2 that now have zero carbon commitments aligned with a 1.5 degree world has increased substantially. 46 companies out of the 149 that we evaluated. And there was only 10 in last year's report. So there's been a dramatic uptake of carbon targets aligned with 1.5 degree in that 150 company data set. And that's over 31% of those 149 companies. And what we present in this report, and one of our conclusions, is that we believe we're actually starting to cross a tipping point of transformation. Social science research demonstrates that when you get over 25% of a population to adopt a new policy or behavior, the rest of the cohort tends to follow suit quickly behind. So now that we have the leading companies, we need to expand that to the rest of the industry. So further good news, if you take those carbon targets as well as the trajectory of impact of the portfolio that we evaluated for scope 1 and 2, you can see that we're actually meeting the Network for Greening the Financial System scenario reductions necessary for the healthcare sector. That scenario shows that we need a 19% reduction by 2030 and a 64% reduction by 2050. And this portfolio, looking at scope 1 and 2 targets, is actually on track. The implied temperature rise is 1.18 degrees C. Again, anything below 1.5 is good. So this is fantastic progress. However, when you include scope 3, the picture is not quite as good. We need a 31% reduction, including scope 3, by 2030, as well as an 81% reduction by 2050 in healthcare overall to be aligned with a 1.5 degree world. Given the current trajectory and the state of targets, we're only targeting a 2.07 temperature degree rise. Again, anything above 1.5 and particularly above 2 is greater than the IPCC warns temperature rise that we must not cross. So we need to expand Scope 3 targets more broadly across the industry beyond that 31%, and we need to include Scope 3 within those reduction targets. One thing that's really interesting to see too is biotech and pharma as a total industry output did increase emissions between 2022 and 2023, but not as quickly, and that makes sense. It's a growing industry, and so far it's only the leading companies that are starting to see year-on-year reductions. But the increase is much more significant in some other industries that biotech and pharma is increasingly reliant upon. In particular, the semiconductor industry has seen a massive growth in carbon emissions over the past year. So a lot that's happening in life science right now is while we're improving the efficiency of our laboratories through automation and integration of new tools like AI and machine learning, we may actually be shifting the environmental impact from in the lab or in vitro experimentation to computational experimentation or in silico experimentation. So we need to make sure that we're looking not only at the impact of this industry, but the impact this industry has on other industries as we adopt new technologies like AI and machine learning that are showing great promise. Further, the Scope 3 impact of biotech and pharma is much greater than Scope 1 and 2 combined. In fact, Scope 3 is 5.4 times higher than Scope 1 and 2 combined, with the majority of that impact coming from purchased goods and services, 83%. And that's actually a higher number than most other industries. It's most similar, actually, in fact, to the semiconductor Scope 3 industry profile. And while 5.4 times higher than Scope 1 and 2 combined seems like a lot, actually some companies that have done much deeper evaluation of their footprint, including AstraZeneca, are finding their Scope 3 is closer to 97%. So we have to include the value chain, and of the value chain, it's really purchased goods and services that are the biggest driver of impact. So MyGreenLab's programs and tools are a proven process to reduce impact in some of the world's most resource-intensive and challenging arenas, laboratories and lab supply chains. MyGreenLab certification, which is widely recognized as the international gold standard for laboratory sustainability best practice, not only drives energy, water, chemical reduction, it also saves companies money. And we've seen a 5x return on investment in 1 year alone, and some of the programs using our new certification are seeing even higher, as high as 14x return on investment. And we quickly learned that you can't have a green lab unless you can buy green products. So MyGreenLab also launched a tool called ACT, which is the world's first and only eco-label for laboratory products. So these tools are targeted for life science on key leverage points. MyGreenLab certification helps drive reductions in Scope 1 and 2 for R&D and QC labs. The ACT label can be a tool for driving Scope 3 reductions for lab supplies. And MyGreenLab certification can also be applied to suppliers to drive reductions in the research value chain. So the ability for our programs to drive measurable impact in one of those key leverage points for the biotech and pharmaceutical industry is why MyGreenLab certification was selected as a breakthrough outcome campaign by the UN Race to Zero. They actually set a target that 95% of labs across major pharma and medtech are MyGreenLab certified at the highest level by 2030. And I'm happy to report many companies are actually making great progress on that goal. So if you're not familiar with the Race to Zero, it's a global campaign to rally leadership and support from companies, universities, investors, cities, even healthcare institutions to be net zero as quickly as possible and by 2050 at the very latest. And they have a very unique and powerful systems transformation model, which first asks that industries achieve a breakthrough ambition. They get over 20%. And as I mentioned, 20% tends to be the tipping point for industry transformation to commit to be net zero. In our portfolio, we have over 31% now. But they don't just set a target and then eventually get to net zero. They also want to set intermediate targets, leading indicators focused on key leverage points in an industry that demonstrate the industry on its pathway to driving overall net zero goals. For biotech and pharma, they selected My Green Lab certification because often when a drug is created and it's on the market, all the environmental impact is already baked in. If you want to drive emissions reductions, you actually have to get the scientists involved and look upstream. So the scientists in the labs really are the heart or the brain of the industry and key to driving those upstream transformations that are going to result in long-term net zero targets and goals and reductions. So for that breakthrough outcome, we're happy to report not only have we seen a significant increase in the number of companies that have committed to the race to zero in the last year. Now we have 36, opposed to 25 last year. 61% of those companies have already adopted My Green Lab certification. The majority of those are pursuing it at a global scale, and one company has actually achieved that 95% certification target. So we're starting to see rapid, accelerating adoption of both zero carbon targets as well as that breakthrough outcome. So people are setting ambitions and then they're walking the talk in their lab. My Green Lab certification, just to keep everybody, fill everybody in, it's an online assessment that's very comprehensive, covering 14 different topic areas, and it's a 3 to 9 month sustainability journey with a focus on behaviors and actions lab members can take in the lab through behavior change to become more sustainable. The way that the program works is we actually engage over 50% of people in the lab. They take an online survey that gives us a sense of the state of best practice in that facility. We provide recommendations for improvement. Labs have a period of time to implement changes. After those changes are implemented, they come back and we issue the survey again. And it's that second survey that determines their certification score. And it's a true continuous improvement process. So we come back every 2 years because the state of best practice changes. And it often takes labs a couple cycles before they're able to get up to our highest certification level, the green level. So far, My Green Lab has been adopted by 41 of the top 50 biotech and pharma companies, and the companies in bold have set targets now from a top line level, from a corporate level, to drive overall impact reduction and adoption. And I love this quote from Penny James, the Chief Operating Officer of biopharmaceuticals at AstraZeneca, that it's a key way that they're accelerating carbon reduction in healthcare R&D and instilling a culture of sustainability. And it's getting those scientists and changing the culture within organizations. That's a lot of the power of the program. So we now have over 3,400 labs in 50 countries, and the program is really growing exponentially. So as I mentioned, while My Green Lab certification is a powerful tool for engaging scientists and driving operational savings, the majority of impacts in purchased goods and services. And you can't have a green lab without buying green products. So My Green Lab introduced in 2018 a tool called ACT, which stands for Accountability, Consistency, and Transparency. It's really a nutrition label for laboratory products that allows scientists and companies to select more sustainable alternatives. We have 40 plus manufacturers already on the database covering consumables, chemicals and reagents, and equipment. And we expect to have over 55 by the end of this year. So we're making incredible progress, but if we look at the entire industry as the ultimate measuring stick of performance, we're still just scratching the surface. There's 3,400 labs globally, or 500 or 500,000 labs globally. We're serving 3,400. That's just 0.7%. There's 8.8 million scientists. We're serving 40,000, which is great, but it's still less than 0.5%. And we know there's over 2 million lab products, and we're only serving 0.7%. So 0.07%. So we know we have to go further and faster to accomplish our long-term vision. That's why we are so excited at COP29 in Dubai last year to announce our Converge Supply Chain Initiative. This was made possible by our founding sponsors, Amgen, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, and GSK, as well as Merck, KGA. And we're very excited that we just added 2 new sponsors to the program recently, Takeda and UCB. So this is an initiative that Devin's going to talk about from BMS in a second, which is harnessing the collective purchasing power of pharma for companies that are walking the talk. They've already implemented My Green Lab certification and got some good results to share that success and train up and support their suppliers to reduce their impact. So it's really targeted to that research value chain. Again, purchased goods and services being the biggest driver of impact in this industry. So we set some ambitious targets. We wanted to have 10 pharma partners join by 2024. We have 7. We're hopeful that we get 3 more before the end of the year, and 100 suppliers committed, all on a trajectory meeting and aligning with the breakthrough outcome target of 95% of labs by 2030. We actually have over 138 unique suppliers engaged and 31 that are actually in the process of certification. And 2 of those that are in the process of certification that actually have already achieved that breakthrough outcome target. So we know it's possible. We've demonstrated it's possible. We just need to scale it up and accelerate transformation. I want to mention, while labs and lab supply chains are important parts of the healthcare value chain and the pharma and biotech value chain, they're not the only thing that needs to transform, obviously, for the industry to achieve net zero. So My Green Lab partners with a number of different collective action initiatives. And one of the really exciting things about this industry is companies have a very clear shared supply chain, and they collaborate pre-competitively to drive industry-wide initiatives. So the Sustainable Markets Initiative Healthcare System Task Force has been taking joint scalable action to accelerate the delivery of net zero. They've been aligning on common supply chain asks, so they're speaking to the market in a common voice. They've been working on decarbonizing clinical trials, as well as supporting renewable energy purchasing in China. In 2021, at COP26, when we first released this report, a new program, Energize, was announced, supported by Schneider Electric, to drive decarbonization across healthcare value chains. And this is allowing and supporting smaller organizations in the supply chain to band together to do joint purchasing of renewable energy, and they've had some great successes in the past year. In the pharmaceutical industry, active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacture, the manufacture of the actual treatments and drugs, tends to be one of the biggest drivers of overall impact. It's a highly energy intensive process. So Manufacture 2030 launched a program called Activate that's gathering data on API manufacturers and pushing them towards science-based decarbonization targets while providing recommendations for operational efficiency. And just recently, Accenture and PSCI announced a new decarbonization playbook for the pharmaceutical industry. It's a really fantastic solution-first document that's providing 28 targeted interventions and a comprehensive roadmap. So all of these programs, as well as the findings of the report, can be found in our 2024 release of the My Green Lab Carbon Impact Report. If you want to find it, simple, just Google My Green Lab 2024 Carbon Report. And if you're interested in learning more about our programs or what we do, please do reach out. My email is simply james@mygreenlab.org. And now I'll hand it over to the moderator and to Larry to go deeper into our methodology for this study.
Well, thank you very much indeed, James. This was really inspiring. And as you said, we're now going to hand it over to your colleague here, Larry Lawrence. He's Vice President and Head of Sustainable Finance at ICE. And that's the Intercontinental Exchange. And take it away, Larry, and we are ready to listen to you. Okay, Larry, we are ready for you. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're ready to listen to your presentation, Larry. So go ahead.
Great. My name is Larry Lawrence. I lead sustainable finance data for ICE, a global company that works with many investors around the world by supplying decision-critical information related to securities, pricing and valuation, as well as trading and other fixed income and equity data sets. James spent a few minutes talking about how he's sort of working directly with labs and pharmaceutical and biotech companies. I'm taking the opposite view. I work with investors, the banks, the asset managers, asset owners who invest in the sector and invest in these companies. So what I'll walk you through today is sort of how we serve those clients, what we do well, and I'll also tie back to what James mentioned, how our data was used in the analysis, and how we've partnered with Green Labs going on multiple years now, which has been an extremely, it's a fantastic collaboration between Green Lab and the ICE climate team. So before I jump in, just note that my views are expressed here on my own. So ICE offers a robust framework that integrates climate risk into financial decision-making. We focus on connecting relevant data to fixed income markets like municipal bonds, mortgage-backed securities, corporate bonds, sovereign bonds, as well as corporate equity and real estate. Our goal is to help investors with a multi-asset class portfolio comprehensively answer some pretty basic questions. What risk do I hold? And how exposed am I across my entire balance sheet? The question that I know investors have struggled to answer. By facilitating this comprehensive view of climate risk, our goal is to help address not only short-term, immediate term, but also long-term challenges. At the heart of a lot of what we do is what we call our geospatial intelligence platform and framework. What we do here is map asset-level climate risk layers, including physical risks like hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and extreme temperature events, as well as transition risks, offers extremely actionable insights. For example, we help asset managers and investors respond to real-time events by enabling them to quickly assess portfolio exposure to extreme weather, as well as portfolio exposure to sort of high-intensity sectors. One of the big questions I usually get is like, what types of questions are you helping your clients with? And again, our clients, the majority of them are asset managers and banks, including some central banks. We often hear from clients that they're grappling with three critical questions. How can I identify investments that are environmentally and socially beneficial? Am I exposed to risks that are not aren't accurately or adequately compensated? And how do I assess portfolio exposure to extreme weather events in real time? We provide analytics and tools that address these questions, helping asset managers, investors better understand their portfolios and to help them better make better data-driven decisions. For example, our sustainable bond analytics enable clients to identify investments that are aligned with environmental and social goals by categorizing bonds based on use of proceeds, impact metrics, and alignment with standards like the UN SDGs. We make it easier to uncover opportunities with meaningful sustainability attributes. Another example is our avoided emissions metrics, which help investors evaluate the climate impact of their investments. This data allows clients to measure how their portfolios contribute to emissions reductions, providing actionable insights to guide decision-making. To address uncompensated risks, we've partnered with several organizations to help advance climate risk modeling in the mortgage-backed security segment, for example. These models help investors assess how climate events, such as flooding and wildfires, how they might impact the underlying properties and cash flows, ensuring risks is appropriately priced and accounted for. I'll give you one example. Here is a snapshot from our Hazard Watch tool, which monitors events, hurricanes, wildfires, and floods in real time and provides updates up to hours, where investors can not only use this to understand which securities in their portfolios are impacted by events that are happening today or events that have happened in the past 2 years, whether that event is a hurricane, of high winds, of moderate winds, or flooding, or even wildfires that happen around the world. This is another view of how we help clients and how clients use our data. This is a very high level view of what we call a mind map. Very straightforward way of looking at the different data sets and contents that we offer. As you can see, I'll spend 2 seconds on this, but climate physical risk is an area where we've done an incredible amount of work driven off of our geospatial platform. Climate transition risk is another area where we've done an incredible amount of work, where we've partnered with My Green Lab to really provide them with data and analytics to support the publication of these reports. Sustainable bonds is another area where we're able to not only look at the impact bond classification, but look at the impact, showing you metrics that help you understand the outcomes of the use of proceeds and the allocation of these assets. Nature and biodiversity, I'm pretty sure pretty common to everyone here, is a topical subject that many of our clients are talking and asking us about as well. Again, our worldview is multi-asset class. We help people solve for the asset classes that have been traditionally underserved by providers in the space. We focus on fixed income because that's what we're great at as an organization, but everything from sovereign debt, corporate debt and equity, mortgage-backed securities, real estate and REITs, and municipal bonds is where we offer incredible insights around climate risk, impact, as well as regulatory oversight and solutions. Let's get into transition risk a bit. We measure transition risk for public and private companies. This is a big part of what was featured in the My Green Lab report. This is pretty helpful as a basic step to help clients not only gather the information they need on the companies that they have exposure to, but also help inform climate scenario analysis, the research and deep dives into target setting and decarbonization strategies. We've collected reported GHG emissions data for years now and cover over 10,000 companies where we've collected reported information. We normalize, we collect, we also categorize by the completeness of the emissions data, whether or not the emissions data is reflective of the company's entire organization or partial. We also collect reported emissions reduction targets data. The targets for 30,000 reported targets are collected, for example, for over 6,000 companies globally. Now, when information isn't reported, and this is a challenge that investors face with, because not all companies report complete information, especially as you move into the private segment, reporting is even less available. Inferring GHG emissions data is absolutely essential to helping investors make decisions today about the potential decarbonization opportunities in their portfolios. So we have built a model that has been used by European central banks, global asset managers, global banks to inform their scenario analysis as well as their stress testing. And most recently, we announced a collaboration with a partner, Dun & Bradstreet, where in the near future, we will be introducing GHG emissions data for tens of millions of private companies around the world, leveraging our best-in-class GHG inferred emissions methodology, as well as the business intelligence supply chain data that Dun & Bradstreet is able to provide. All in, we provide and cover the most critical data inputs that investors need today, including Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as well as the emissions intensity, Scope 3 emissions, all 15 categories, and where they're not available, we infer the emissions. We also produce implied temperature rise, as well as cover emissions reductions targets. And what's a pretty topical area is avoided emissions, where clients are pretty interested in that data set as well. So all in, this is the area where we've partnered with My Green Lab, where they leverage this data for the biotech and pharmaceutical sector to inform a lot of the reporting and the insights that James previously shared. So I'll talk about a few things. While James sort of drilled down and dug into the biotech and pharmaceutical sector, I'll take a step back and provide a sort of a cross-sector view of how things look today. So this slide shows the sector rank of biotech and pharma against all sectors in our directly analyzed universe. So the 10,000 plus companies that we collect in the emissions data for and that we analyze closely. The analysis uses the median as to eliminate any bias due to potential different sample size per sector. The analysis is based on the 2023 data set with emissions occurring in 2022. The biotech and pharma sector, as you can see here, starts pretty low or relatively low in terms of carbon intensity, both for scope 1 and 2, as well as scope 1, 2, and 3, and even lower than other sectors that are traditionally considered low carbon, such as tech and media. So compared to the relatively high emitting sectors, magnitudes lower, and even compared to the traditionally low emitting sectors like tech and media, biotech and pharma performs relatively well. This is consistent with our findings and analysis over the last 3 years as well, with biotech and pharma consistently being ranked lower, with slight improvements observed over the last 2 years. So kudos to the biotech and pharma industry, and I think that supports a lot of what James mentioned earlier. Now, if we look at scope 3 and the different categories and the contribution to the sector, purchased goods and services category 1 is by far the biggest scope 3 category contributor for biotech and pharma, with almost 79% of overall scope 3 emissions. For the best disclosing companies in the sector, about 149 companies where disclosure categories 1 and 2, and for data that we collect, we rank and score the disclosure quality of these companies. So disclosure categories, category 1, for example, disclosure is complete and there is sort of third-party assurance. And then category 2 is disclosure is complete. Having said that, there are a few large players in the sector for which sort of use of sold products, category 11 is the biggest contributor to scope 3. And this is due to their inhaler products. We even see the contribution of one single scope 3 category to the overall scope 3 being relatively higher in this sector compared to other sectors where the highest scope 3 category makes up around 40 to 50% of the overall scope 3 of that sector. Again, using the median analysis to eliminate any sector universe bias. If we look at the top 25 companies by revenue within the biotech and pharma sector, we see high levels of reporting in terms of disclosure. 77% of the top 25 companies have reported all 15 categories of scope 3. Improved scope 3 reporting has been observed within the overall data set as well. Now, let's talk a bit about scenario alignment and net zero 2050. So we're looking at only scope 1 and 2. We'll jump into scope 1, 2, and 3 in a moment. Many clients use our net zero analysis tools to do this type of analysis on a given portfolio, multiple portfolios, and even compare it to a benchmark. So as per our net zero analysis, this includes historical emissions of companies, as well as emissions targets, alongside the NGFS phase 4 scenarios. We see that biotech and pharma sector, again, we're using 149 companies that have the best disclosure and complete category 1 and category 2 disclosure, again, complete and assured. We see that the biotech and pharma sector for these 149 companies are currently lower than the required carbon budget to reach 1.5 degrees in 2050. As per the NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenario. The sector is also expected to reach the required level of decarbonization by 2050 and be aligned to that scenario. This translates into an implied temperature rise of 1.2 degrees global warming by 2100. As James mentioned earlier, well below the 1.5 degree target. This means that the 149 companies in the sector have shown great momentum in terms of emissions reductions in the past few years. It's important to note that this relates to scope 1 and 2 emissions of the sector only and assumes that all companies will follow the ambitious targets that they have set and achieve them. We have expanded the number of companies considered for this analysis this year with greater coverage and more directly analyzed companies. However, we also observe an increase in companies setting targets, which is reflected in this pathway, in the scenario pathway and the ITR. Let's look at this and consider scopes 1, 2, and 3 for the same 149 companies. Now, same idea, using our net zero analysis tool, again, which includes historical emissions of companies as well as emissions reduction targets. We see that the biotech and pharma sector, again, these 149 companies with the best disclosure, is currently lower than the required carbon budget of 1.5 degrees to 2050. Having said that, the sector is not expected to reach the required level of decarbonization in 2050 and be aligned to the scenario. So there's a gap that you can see here, 39 kilotons of CO2 emissions. This translates into an implied temperature rise of 2.1 global warming potential for 2100. This means that these 149 companies in the sector have shown great momentums in terms of emissions reductions in the past few years. Again, this is calculated in terms of intensities to reduce any size variations. So these companies have seen tremendous momentum in the past few years, as well as have set various decarbonization targets and even scope 3 emissions. Most other sectors have higher implied temperature rise when including scope 3. Just to put that in context, it's important to note that this relates to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of the sector and assumes that companies will follow the ambitious decarbonization targets that they're set. With that, I'll pause here and turn it back to James. I believe we're going to head over to Devin in a minute, but I'll turn it back over to the moderator and go from there.
So thank you, Larry. Let's go now to Devin Carsdale, Associate Director of Sustainability at Bristol Myers Squibb, for a 10-minute presentation before we go into some questions at the end of the panel. So over to you, Devin. All right, Devin, so we're ready for you to just fire away. We're ready for you.
Well, thank you, Connelly, so much for having me, and a big welcome to all those who are able to join in. My name is Devin Carsdale. I lead our sustainable procurement and responsible sourcing agenda at Bristol Myers Squibb, which is a global biopharmaceutical company headquartered in the United States, but has operations all over the world. As you heard from the other panelists today, there's a lot of attention on supply chain and scope 3. And so I'll talk a bit about how our program is managing the subject, what goals we've committed to, and how we're working across our industry to enable and accelerate the agenda. So what I will do is present a bit of the work here, and hopefully you will be able to see this presentation clearly. Okay, so let's talk a bit about our sustainable procurement agenda. So first, let's define it a bit. What do we mean when we say sustainable procurement, right? And from the BMS point of view, we're talking about acting responsibly and ethically in the end-to-end procurement process, right? It's about embedding principles, but also embedding objective criteria so we can really understand what is the sustainability risk and performance profile of our suppliers, and having that increasingly mean something from an objectivity and a sourcing perspective in the procurement process. But it's also for us as a large publicly traded enterprise that's exposed to global regulation. It's about taking accountability and demonstrating transparency from a due diligence perspective of how we are proactively working with our supplier partners from an environmental and social perspective. And it's about actively partnering with supplier partners to continuously improve. I think a potential stigma of the work is that it's pass fail, or that if you're not doing this well, you may be perceived as a bad actor. But one of our big engagement pillars, right, is that this is a journey. BMS itself is very much on a journey, and there's a long way ahead of it in terms of working on and achieving its ambitious environmental sustainability goals. And that's no different for our supplier partners. And we view it in that prism, and we want to work with those that are embedding the practices inside of their own operations and work collaboratively to, discover what are those low carbon or more sustainable products and services of tomorrow. The other piece of this, right, that we view this from is that climate risk is business risk, right? So when you think about the context in which we're operating, as everybody knows, right, the climate is changing in real time, and that all can experience, right, no matter where you sit around the world. And so, obviously from a regulation perspective, what we see in the EU, but other major markets as well, is that we're going to be increasingly exposed to report on how we are, sort of at risk and exposed to an increasingly vulnerable and changing climate, right? But from a continuity of supply, this is a really critical issue because we can't ultimately fulfill on our mission of delivering medicines to patients if our supply chain is inherently threatened or vulnerable, right? So from a continuity of supply, it's really important for us to understand how is climate impacting our suppliers, right? From the raw materials they may be sourcing to the geographies that they may be sitting in from a production or sourcing perspective, right? And how do we work with those suppliers to mitigate some of that impact, to diversify some of our sourcing, right? And then ultimately work with the right actors who are taking this work seriously to be as best prepared for a changed climate as we can be. So what does that mean for BMS in the context of goals and objectives? What you'll see on the left are a few of our environmental goals. By 2024, this year, and actually just in July, a few months ago, we did receive validation for our science-based target emission reduction targets, which include both a near-term target for scopes 1, 2, and 3, as well as a net zero target. I'll talk about that in a moment. You'll see just below, also by 2030, we'll have 100% of our purchased electricity coming from renewable sources, which we are on track to do, which addresses our scope 2 emissions. And then you'll see by 2040, we have a number of other goals, including having zero waste to landfill, having our fleet be 100% electric, an equitable water goal, and so forth. So if you look over to the right, I starred on the left, you'll see those stars that is specific to where the supplier engagement and our scope 3 work is tied directly into our enterprise targets. And just to drill into that a bit on the right-hand side, what does that really mean? So for those that are familiar with the Science-Based Target Initiative, if you do have more than 40% of your emissions coming from scope 3, you have to have some type of scope 3 target, right? In the case of BMS, we've committed that a majority of our emissions, in this case, about 74% of our emissions, through our supply base, will have set their own science-based targets by 2028, right? So we're not far away from that, particularly as those that are familiar with that process. It can be a multi-year process to have your commitments, go through that validation process. What I want to point out, and I know some of our other organizations, that were mentioned either on this panel, but certainly throughout the pharma industry, is that the majority of emissions do come from our supply chain. So if you look at our bottom right, you'll see that about 83% of our emissions are coming from our supply chain. So even if our scope 1 and 2, which are the direct emissions that are coming from the BMS enterprise, completely zeroed out their emissions, right, we would still have the bulk of the work to do in the value chain. That's why it's so critical to engage our suppliers early, right? And so one of the things we've seen in the relatively early days of rolling out our supplier engagement program is that there's a big distribution curve of supplier maturity and capabilities when it comes to setting climate goals, measuring emissions, right, and having plans accordingly to decarbonize. What we're seeing is that it's about a third of suppliers that are really well positioned to tackle this, have potentially approved science-based targets, or close to. We see that there's about a third of suppliers that are somewhere in that journey. Maybe they've started to measure emissions. They haven't quite set public-facing targets yet. And then we see a third are just getting started. So with that level of diversity in the climate maturity of our supply chain, there's a lot of work to do to get everybody on the same page and rowing in the same direction. That's a lot of the work that our team is doing right now, is working closely with our procurement teams to reach out, offer resources, but ultimately align around the accountability and the urgency of the goal and make sure that there's going to be a plan in place should that supplier be a long-term partner of BMS. The other part of this that's really important, right? Obviously, James talked a lot about the My Green Lab certification process. BMS is involved in a number of different industry collaborations, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But one of the key pillars that we find is that we want to make sure that if there are any and all solutions that are going to help accelerate this supply chain decarbonization journey, we want to be part of that solution, particularly if it's amongst our pharmaceutical peers. So we've seen the My Green Lab certification process for ourselves, and you see a bit of a timeline here as BMS itself is a partner and is implementing many labs to go through that certification process. This past year, we went through the freezer challenge. So there's a number of initiatives that we're going through this year. And that brings obviously a little level of credibility and also a level of awareness, right? That we know as an enterprise what this takes to start implementing this work in our own operations. But what we also understand, again, from a scale and an impact perspective, if we want to bring this ultimately to bear at a big impact, we need to work with our partners and we need to work with our suppliers to bring this to life. That's why we also founded, you'll see in late last year, as James mentioned at the last COP, we became a founding sponsor of Converge, right? So Converge is one of those industry programs in partnership with My Green Lab to bring that certification to life at scale with other supplier partners. And as James mentioned in the impact report, there's just a very small percentage of all labs across the world that are engaging in these practices. So we think there's enormous potential and opportunity for supplier partners who do have significant lab operations and environmental impact to engage with us to drive change. So one thing I wanted to show on the left, right, is sort of a summation of some of the asks that we do of our suppliers. And a couple of things I wanted to mention about this. One thing is that all of these programs on the left are global programs or global rating agencies that are known throughout the world. That was very important to us. We work with thousands of suppliers and we're actively engaging hundreds of suppliers in real time on these programs. And so having globally recognized names and programs that are validated and well benchmarked, both inside of pharma and outside, brings a level of harmonization and consistency that is a key pillar of our work, right? What we don't want is to create redundant but not quite the same asks of suppliers that creates more administrative burden for them to ultimately deliver on the agenda. We want our folks to our supplier partners to get to the work of decarbonization and of course, reporting on their progress along the way. We don't want them to spend fruitless time and effort on more questionnaires that are not adding value, right? So we've really tried to streamline and harmonize what that looks like inside of these programs, right? CDP is one of the world's largest environmental questionnaires, right? We leverage that climate change questionnaire in our CDP supply chain program. And so we're working with some of our top emitting suppliers to really understand their data more granularly so we can design the evolution of our supplier engagement work and really understand what are those emissions that are driving BMS's Scope 3 footprint. From a target setting process, obviously you see Science-Based Target Initiative there. We are working with those suppliers that make up the majority of our emissions to set their own science-based targets by 2028. You see our responsible sourcing program we launched a little bit earlier this year, again, to a number of our strategic supplier partners that represent an outsized amount of sustainability risk in our supply chain. And again, with EcoVadis as in our environmental sustainability targets, it's about understanding where our suppliers stand from an ESG risk and performance perspective. It is not a pass-fail, but it's really the opportunity to understand apples to apples compared to their peers and their industry and their geography and their size. Where do they stand from a competency and capability perspective? And that data objectively can then start getting baked into our supplier relationship management activities with our category teams. We can start using it and leveraging it inside of sourcing activities in the future, right? And all of that is going to drive performance and accountability and visibility to our enterprise goals. And as we mentioned earlier, to regulation obligations. And then finally, towards the bottom, you'll see Converge. There's a number of other programs, including Energize, including we have a partnership with M2030 and their Activate program for active pharmaceutical ingredient suppliers. We're a partner of the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, PSCI. So we're in a number of places very intentionally, because again, with a very wide supply base and understanding that capabilities for our suppliers are in quite a wide place, we want to make sure that we are driving a diverse set of solutions depending on what our suppliers' needs are to ultimately drive action. It doesn't mean that those are solutions at the end or be all, but it does mean that we're trying to find practical solutions beyond just asking our suppliers for more and more and more. What we also understand about Converge is that the My Green Lab certification process, for those that are aware of the game of baseball, right? In terms of all the different ways to decarbonize, I like to think of the lab certification process as hitting singles, right? It's some of the more accessible, easier to implement actions that an organization can take to decarbonize. Some of the other actions, including, buying a large scale supply of renewable energy over a 10 to 15-year term in, for example, a virtual power purchase agreement or VPPA, that might be a triple or a home run, right? But in the case of Converge, what we're seeing is that it's relatively easy to adopt, it's easy to scale, and there's a quick return on investment, in many cases within just 12 months of implementing these practices. And so, again, that's not excluding one from the other. There's all these different tools, but again, what we're trying to offer is a diverse set of practices for our suppliers to adopt. And I'll close with this. As much as we are offering all these different programs, our pharmaceutical industry has really coalesced around a pretty tight set of asks when it comes to decarbonization. And all of the brands you can see here on this slide who are members of that PSCI are asking their respective suppliers to make decarbonization commitments in the form of science-based targets. So at the end of the day, we hear a lot from our suppliers, well, why are we necessarily asking for this? Or is this a trend? Well, I am here to say, yes, it is. This is overwhelmingly the consensus in the pharmaceutical space that we all collectively want action from a sustainability perspective. And we recognize that the more we work together collaboratively, the more that we can drive collective change. And so it's been a big focus, whether it's in PSCI, in Energize, in Converge, and elsewhere. The more we can harmonize our asks and the more we can make our programs consistent and the more we can narrow the entry points for our suppliers to engage with us, the better uptake we have and the faster we can move. So ultimately, that's what we're committed to driving, and that's a bit about the work that we're doing at BMS. So I will stop sharing there. And again, I want to just say a big thank you for inviting me to share a bit about Bristol Myers Squibb Scope 3 and responsible sourcing work, and happy to be in touch with you afterwards. Thank you again.
So let's start with some questions for James and Larry, and hope maybe we can bring Devin back. So James, in terms of the certifications and the standards that you talked about earlier on, what are your hopes and thoughts for the MGLC 2.0 in terms of this new version? What change can it drive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've gone through a revision and update process for My Green Lab certification over the past 2.5 years based upon the experience of the thousands of labs that have gone through it. And we've introduced a new version that just launched at AstraZeneca and will be rolling out globally in January, where we can actually measure the environmental impact of the actions that people are taking in the lab. So I mentioned a 5x return on investment. Some of the early pilot projects actually have shown even greater, close to a 14x return on investment through 1 year alone. So we're actually able to track for each lab and then aggregate that data across a whole portfolio to get carbon emission reductions for that particular company, and then actually aggregate that across the industry or within a supply chain like in the Converge program. So we've added additionally a third-party verification component, so ultimately making the program much more rigorous and much more useful for people to measure and reduce their environmental impact.
Thank you. So what can you say in terms of the impact of the Act Eco label program also that you've been talked about previously in your presentation? How about the impact of the Eco label?
Yeah, so ACT is a great tool for driving lab supply reduction and for procurement to use to select more sustainable products. And it looks like maybe we got Devin back, so we can hand it over to him to delve into sustainable procurement in a little bit more detail.
So turning now to you, Larry, how can being open about climate data actually help the biotech and pharma companies to attract investors and to find more sustainable ways to innovate? What can you say about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, my point of view is working with investors, so the banks, the asset managers, within those organizations, those running risk functions, the analysts who are evaluating these opportunities in these firms, and data is king, right? Like they just need more data. I think there are a few things that are top of mind when it comes to data. So obviously, more data, more transparency on data is critical. But two areas where that's becoming more and more relevant. One, investors want to know more about asset level data. Where in your organization is this relevant to? What locations? What geographic footprint? And then, as Devin sort of started jumping into, supply chain is obviously a pretty significant focus given the scope 3 contribution to overall emissions. So more transparency into the supply chain is absolutely critical. Companies have a hard time doing that because many of them work with lots of different suppliers. On the data side, we're helping triangulate a lot of that for investors because we can get supply chain data, look at traffic of goods around the world, look at where all of these suppliers are located, and then link them back to the assets and back to the companies to help investors make more informed decisions. So Devin, it looks like you're back. I was just talking about suppliers and how that's critical to investors in getting more information about how your supply chain contributes to your overall emissions profile and your decarbonization strategy. You were talking about this, so it sounds like you're back. So I'll turn it back to you to continue.
Actually, I don't have a go-ahead for Devin yet. I don't see him on my screen here in Baku. So
Okay.
let's continue with you, Larry.
Okay.
As climate data becomes more important in companies' decisions, what ways do you see for turning emissions into metrics, like the ITR scores, for instance? What can you tell us
Yep.
about those?
Yeah. So I think there are a few things that are critical that investors are looking for, and they're looking for answers to. And Devin, I tried. Sorry. The one thing that's critical, investors are keen to know how will this impact the valuation of a firm and how the asset or the security for that firm is priced. And there are a couple of things that's critical there. Like how is your investment in decarbonization or investment in new sources of energy impacting CapEx, for example? How is that going to change over time? So those are the critical things. I think what investors are asking partners like us to do is translate all of this information into terms that they can understand, that they can use as inputs and into their models and their workflows. And the big part of that is how does it translate into price and valuation? That's a critical next step. And that's a big part of what we help investors solve for. And companies should be aware of that.
Thank you very much, Larry. James, turning to you now, and what would you say are the which would you say are the or what would you say are the biggest hurdles for biotech and pharma to get over in order to really fully embrace sustainability?
Yeah, I think one of the programs I mentioned, Converge, really points to the biggest challenge that companies have. They can obviously set their own targets, they can drive their own emissions reductions efforts, but since they have a shared supply chain and they're reliant upon getting those suppliers engaged in order to overall achieve their emissions reduction targets. And as we saw, if you look at scope 3, the picture is much more difficult. We're actually not aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So collective action initiatives are really the solution that can help overcome that challenge. So programs like Converge, where 7 of the largest pharma companies are uniting to drive emissions reductions, and other tools like Energize, where pharma is actually collaborating on a pre-competitive basis, are really crucial so they can speak to the market in a common voice. And as Devin mentioned, not just demand things of their suppliers, but actually help them along that journey by providing a clear path for transformation. And in that way, the whole industry can actually advance and move together effectively.
Thank you, James. Larry, would you like to add to this question?
I think James did a wonderful job answering it. The only thing I'll add is, even with all the data that's already out there, you get two things from investors. I almost have too much information to know what to do with, and I don't have enough information to make decisions. So the question is, how do you bring those two conflicting opinions together to help them make decisions? And then a lot of that has to do with us taking all of this data, synthesizing it into metrics that are helpful to decision making, like the ITR, like sort of distilling things into climate value at risk and other components like that. I think those are critical to the conversation.
Thank you, Larry. So how do you see the role of regulators and international organizations in this transition? That's a question to both of you, but let's start with you, Larry.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's pretty critical, right, in order to sort of influence change and encourage people to move in the right direction. I mean, based on the analysis that we see, and obviously pretty positive momentum from a number of the industries, including biotech and pharma, in setting these targets and increasing the reporting and disclosure. So I think that's critical. But I think where regulators can play an important role is to sort of help people standardize and harmonize around the things that are most relevant, the things that are most material, because the challenges a lot of companies face is sometimes the cost to disclose and the cost to comply. It is significant. I don't think people appreciate and recognize how difficult it is for companies to meet all of these different mandates. So I think making it easier is critical to making it more readily available. So I think that's the direction where I'd like to see them go more.
Thank you, Larry. And how about you, James?
Yeah, I would just add, in agreement with what Larry had to say, standards, programs like My Green Lab certification really offer opportunities for simplification across the industry and alignment behind rigorous tools that can be third-party verified. My Green Lab certification, it's interesting. It's not a regulatory-driven program. It's voluntary, just like the Science-Based Target Initiative has been. And we're seeing massive adoption because companies know their investors, their stakeholders, their customers expect them to meet net zero targets. And so we're going to see an increasing growth of standards, not just at the highest level for reporting, but actually on how people are implementing changes on the ground. And that's why tools like My Green Lab certification are so powerful. While voluntary standards are great, eventually we do need regulatory support. One of the big pieces of legislation for our organization that's going to be very influential is the European Green Claims Directive. They've actually set standards around high quality environmental certifications and will require third-party verification of environmental claims from 2026 moving forward. So this will clean up and ensure everybody's following really high quality standards, which ultimately will drive faster, harmonized uptake and accelerate progress towards net zero.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Larry and James and Devin. Maybe you can hear us. I'm so sorry that we weren't able to establish a steady connection with Devin for his presentation. We heard a little part of it, but it's really important the work you do, and best of luck with your continued efforts to make this field of the economy more sustainable. It's looking very strong what you do. So thank you very much. And now let's move on.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.